Hello. All right, welcome everybody. So excited to have you all here for our first landscape architecture lecture of the semester. I'm Justin Parsher. I'm assistant professor in practice of landscape architecture. And tonight we are very excited to welcome Rosetta Elkin. We've asked Rosetta to speak for 45, 50 minutes in that range. Then we'll have time for Q&A. After that, we ask if you do have a time commitment after Rosetta's initial talk and you really, really want to leave, please don't leave because it's going to be an awesome Q&A. But if you really need to leave, please do it quickly and quietly so that we can move on. All right, that being out of the way, I want to give a hopefully brief introduction to Rosetta. So across her career, Rosetta Elkin has focused on the relationship between plant life and human life. And Elkin is really at the forefront of a tendency in our fields right now to imagine and create different versions of that relationship. How else can we do it? If we continue to treat plants as objects, as instruments, as means to an end, we're going to end up perpetuating relationships that are paradoxical, perverse, and self-defeating. But if we can see plants and work with them, we can create mutually beneficial relationships that can help get us all together through to a difficult future. So, quick introduction to how that has come through in three spheres of her work. First, Elkin is a scholar, and she's conveniently left me an illustration of that here. I'm going to highlight two recent books, of which this is one. This is Plant Life, The Entangled Politics of Afforestation from last year. And because that wasn't enough, this year she is back with Landscapes of Retreat. And those two books make a really interesting contrast. Plant Life is focusing on a set of large shelter belt projects that are trying to assert human control over the environment. And Landscapes of Retreat is describing a set of new landscape initiatives that, borrowing some of her words here, quote, renew relations among people and place, and particularly in the light of climate change. And I want to stress that if you are interested in what you see today, this book is available for free via our library. You can get it as PDFs permanently, which is awesome. Landscapes of Retreat is currently out there as a website, landscapesofretreat.com. That's the whole thing, which is terrific. And of course, if you're able, you could always pay for them too and support the folks who make them. Second, as the founder and principal of Practice Landscape, Elkin puts that work into practice. If you look at Practice Landscape's website at practicelandscape.com, you will see a few renderings, plans, sections, and a whole lot of photographs. Photographs of hands digging, arrays of pots, piles of logs. Elkin is a critic of landscape work that is conducted remotely and without engagement, and has instead devoted a career to centering field work, believing that, quote, landscape is a process, not a product. So that's included ongoing work in climate adaptation at sites that range from a farm in Illinois to a shoreline in Quebec. Practice has also spun off a nonprofit, the Practice Foundation, that seeks to, again quoting, open access and expand approaches to landscape design by funding individuals and groups committed to alternative practices. They awarded 3 initiatives last year, currently accepting applications for another. Check them out. Be aware in general that, as you might tell, as a believer in open access publishing, Rosetta uses that site as a platform, hosts her articles, interviews, all sorts of published projects there. We could use more good internet rabbit holes in landscape architecture. This is a really good one. Finally, Elkin is an educator. In 2021, having taught at McGill and Harvard, she started as the academic director of Pratt's new MLA program. And of course, to do such a thing in 2021 is to stare emergency right in the face. So Elkin has been meeting this challenge with a curriculum that foregrounds, again, quote, hotter ecology, urban soils, fieldwork methods, and a critical analysis of design history. And if I mention that, among other things, she has won her own prize, is a research associate at Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, and has exhibited at venues ranging all the way from the Victoria and Albert to the Isabella Stewart Gardner. That is all just to say Rosetta Elkin is a major figure in our field. So hopefully all of you who know and love our program can already see how much she has in common with our cares, our concerns, and our aspirations, and can imagine how much she has to share with us. So please join me in welcoming Rosetta Elkin.
That was such a pleasant and wonderful introduction. I just felt like a lot of gratitude. It's very generous. I digress that I will not be talking about landscapes of retreat today. I will be talking about plant life, and I will be talking a lot about. So variations, I don't think I'll take up the whole time. And then we can talk more about climate adaptation and whatnot. But generally, I work on lands that are either needful of more water or tend to have too much water. Today, we'll talk about the lack thereof. So I also fine-tuned the title to Think Little, the Rise of Billion Tree Planting Programs and the Plants Who Resist Them. I'm suggesting another title because landscape architecture and the design fields, more broadly, are stuck in a think big attitude that has very material consequences. It might not look like landscape architecture, but these trillion tree planting campaigns go through much the same process as any design project. Because planting a tree is somehow always deemed an environmental gain, no matter where it unfolds. So this is an excerpt. I'll read you an excerpt from an essay by Wendell Berry, first published in the Whole Earth Catalog in 1969. Thinking big, he says, has led us to the two biggest and cheapest political dodges of our time, plan making and law making. The result mostly has been the persistence of the problem and the enlargement and enrichment of the government. Berry reminds us that there is no public crisis that is not also private. And I would add that separation of the public realm from the private realm is also artificial, and yet it delineates our profession. Nature from culture, work from home, man from woman. These binaries used to be a matter of fact, but the lines are blurring. And so now, firmly rooted as we are in the 21st century, it's rather remarkable that Berry's advice is to make sense of the crisis as a personal affair and start gardening. I've been thinking small for a while, and in my own work, I take gardening as a prompt to bridge horticulture and ecology, construction and cultivation, public and personal benefit. By the way, the slides are just gonna go. I'm either gonna align or not, just so you know. But what we're up against is a culture that has nearly destroyed its relationship to plant life. Our profession in particular has given up its independence and confidence in plants and in gardening in return for cheap seductions of imagery and the shoddy products of so-called standards. We've delegated so many of our vital responsibilities to developers and to agents, to bureaucrats and to experts of all sorts. Even species selection, such a simple part of what we do, right, is outsourced to the availability and convenience of nursery stock, leaving us essentially landless. This urge to slow down and take stock is also a tenet of how I teach, and I am so pleased to be leading a curriculum in landscape architecture that embraces the same urgency, the daily rituals and reprise of Think Little. But this is a challenge in Brooklyn, as you can imagine, in a city of millions swept up in the processes of construction, concretization, and urbanization. But herein lies the possibility of paying attention to the most common and misunderstood among us. Plant life is everywhere. It can be studied, managed, subdued, eradicated, and celebrated, no matter what corner of the world we find ourselves. We are a plant-dependent species. And our world relies on the relationships established by plant life and with plant life. In refusing to behave, however, through our species' cultural and scientific associations, plants often create a glitch in the system, a resistance to thinking big. Plants often refuse to scale up, speed up, or grow up. So in my recent publication, I advocate for a closer reading of plant life to inform the landscape scale and collide with conservation mandates, restoration efforts that are essentially design projects. I center this discussion on how society and culture came to rely on the simplicity of this thing we call tree planting. The particular form of tree planting that interests me is the most radical one. It's called afforestation. Afforestation is the deliberate planting of trees in otherwise treeless environments. The image that graces the cover of the book is not an image of afforestation. It is plant life at its most inspired. It is an image of spontaneously growing Populus euphratica, an ancient population in the Tarim Basin in Western China. These plants are widely regarded as some of the oldest in the world, but that's not because they're individuals, but one ageless clone. On the ground, clonal populations share space. Clonal roots are linked by innumerable forms of cooperation, overriding the image of a single tree. Populus euphratica invites a vast network into its consortium, from soil bacteria to pastoral practices. These are powerful plants. This, on the other hand, is powerless. This is a tree of afforestation. The plants of afforestation, as I mentioned earlier, are planting in otherwise treeless environments. So the question I asked throughout the research for this book is actually quite a simple one, and it's encouraging to ask simple questions because they complicate themselves. Why do we plant trees in places without trees? And then, how do trees help us reckon with the environment? I ask these questions because tree planting is not exceptional, but actually because it is so common. Depending on the species, after all, planting a tree can either be one of the ultimate offerings to living on the planet, or one of the most extreme perversions over it. Afforestation is easy to count. Deforestation is a slippery slope that is very, very difficult to count. Numbers add up in afforestation. Numbers do not seem to matter in deforestation. So the politics of afforestation are located exactly in that discrepancy. And I look at 3 tree planting projects or campaigns that suggest the past, present, and future of afforestation. Chronologically, the cases begin in the earliest 20th century, shadowing the American Great Plains, enduring in the mid-century in Western China, and is scheduled to blanket the sub-Sahel in the 21st century. You might notice at this point that each context is vastly different, despite its temporal, biotic, and social contexts, which is only relevant insofar as, despite the differences, each landscape is classified as a dry land. The 3 frameworks that the book uses are artifact, index, and trace. You saw that in an earlier slide. Because to reckon with this kind of reality and to get design awards, UNCCD awards, and a lot of kudos from the angiocracy is to wonder where we're going as a species. Artifact is a framework that sheds light on how the study of plants generally condenses aliveness. Index is a word I use to talk about the mechanics of expertise and lists. And the aggregate effect describes how the value of plant life is arrested as an object of study in artifact and becomes a unit of profit in index. But it's that third procedure, trace, where drip line and pumps and species selection start to matter to our field. One of the plants that I really enjoyed writing about that's in this book is Fadeherbia. That's the plant you'll see in this image and the fruit in the next. It has a marvelous deciduous reverse phenology, which basically means that it doesn't have leaves when all the other trees do. It's obviously a little more than that, but let's say it's as simple as that. So every country from Jakarta to Djibouti along the sub-Saharan range who's trying to buy into this project wants to add Faidherbia to their list, but it's never on the list. So that starts to shed light on the way that I approach the method to the research, right? If it's not on the list, why isn't it on the list? As a landscape architect, you have to ask yourselves those simple questions. Well, it's not on the list for a very, very beautiful reason, which is why I call it a glitch in the system. It's not on the list because it doesn't work very well in pots. It has a taproot, and it doesn't take well to nursery standards. So it's off the list, but that doesn't mean it's off the planet or out of mind. Here's another plant that I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time talking about so that maybe we can have an interesting discussion about what it means to draw plants, spec plants, be upstairs in your studios thinking about plants, Latin binomials, what do they mean? What we really want to be thinking about is plant behavior. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to a lively plant known as blowout beard tongue, or Penstemon hyendi, a rare perennial forb whose entire global presence is limited to the Nebraska sandhills. The plant didn't make it into the book. The sandhills are an anomaly in the geography of the Great Plains, an undulating dune system that provides habitat for blowout beard tongue among manifold other species that find refuge in these last traces of the North American grassland. The sandhills are also home to the contradictions between ranchers and farmers, irrigation and drought, planting trees, and restoring grasses. No other biome is as abused or mistreated as grasslands, and much of the exploitation comes from afforestation, from tree planting. A deep and rich history of campaigning for the tree planting from Texas to the Canadian border as a state-scaled solution to so-called soil erosion, a major part of the New Deal program, and a reminder to think a little bit about as we talk about things like the Green New Deal. Grasslands are also home to the contradictions of conservation, since the tree planting efforts I describe in the section on the United States in the book are born of the conservation movement. Soil conservation was a policy and a process. It was a narrative encounter between incentivized federal regulation on a highly mobile and itinerant landscape. Blowouts are the ultimate symbol of failed settlement, of poor ranching and poor farming. Blowouts originate in the exposed upper slopes where grass cover is broken or depleted from disturbance. Blowouts don't really care if they originate from fire, flood, settlement, or overgrazing. Neither does this plant. As the common name suggests, blowout beard tongue is a specialist of these bare sands, and they simply cannot be urged to grow elsewhere. No blowout, no beard tongue. Conservation is a word used and abused in the Sandhills. It was used to reassure settled colonialism. It is used to advocate for taming the sand, to build fences and roads, and it was used to insist that planting trees was the solution to the Dust Bowl era. In the Sandhills, the struggle to hold and demarcate land endures to this day in the friction between savvy ranchers and short rotation farmers, in the making and unmaking of ownership lines in a mobile landscape. Climate change poses an entirely new set of problems relative to life in the Sandhills. As conservation mandates just pile up, piles of ideas that still rely on planting to tame the land, a so-called quick fix solution to justify production through detachment. Remove earthly contact, remove relationship between plants and people. As Vine Deloria Jr. reminds us, the greatest accomplishment of the Bureau of Indian Affairs was not the taking of land, but the making of indigenous landlessness. Or, as Aldo Leopold states, the problem then is how to bring about a striving for harmony with land among a people, many of whom have forgotten there is any such thing as land at all, among education and culture and students who have become landless. I hope that sheds a little bit of light on what it means to be a landscape architect if we are primarily a landless culture. In Nebraska, landlessness was imposed, but the effects do not lie in the past tense. It is not a history that can be left kind of over there. The authority of landlessness ripples across time and affects each of us in different ways and affects how we work. Herein lies the possibility of paying attention to an uncommon and endangered forb, that resists all human efforts to manage or tame it. In refusing to behave through our species' cultural and scientific inconsistencies, blowout beard tongue creates another glitch in the system, a 2-foot-tall resistance. It refuses to scale up, speed up, or grow up, as I mentioned. This is inspiring to me. It's on no lists anywhere. Germination cannot be fixed by botany, by policy, by design, or by eager interest groups that fund afforestation, restoration, spreading seed, or initiating replanting schemes. Rather, blowouts take swaths of land offline, and only the blowout can take it back. The blowout beard tongue can take it back. So I'm interested to think with those plants that slip through these kinds of cracks, that maneuver out of our way, and in so doing quietly undermine the stories we tell one another, publish, and circulate. To borrow from Eric Wolf, the anthropologist, to give others without history a voice, a chance to be known. Blowout beard tongue has no history. The history, instead, the life history of blowout beard tongue is indelibly linked to the movement of its dune habitat, to its landscape. Thus, the landscape and the plant travel as partners. Any recovery of the plant species is entirely dependent on the recovery of blowouts in an ecological and a cultural mind. Blowout beard tongue is federally listed as an endangered species, added to Category 2 in 1980, and formally listed in 1987 on the endangered list by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The only place on the planet where it grows, this pretty little plant and its seeds, is in the Nebraska sandhills, with only 3 small and relatively recently discovered patches just across the state line in the Ferris Dunes of Wyoming. I've spent time in the sandhills, as you can tell, to better understand why, with an abundance of seed, bags and shelves of seed, why blowout beard tongue remains firmly rooted on the endangered plant list. It would seem to reside more endemically on the list than in blowouts, since we are staring down 4 decades of restoration efforts by humans, but there's more. Blowout beard tongue is likely endangered because it has no history. It is easy to overlook others without history. It is an ordinary plant. Imagine only 8 recorded collections across 4.8 million hectares were ever made since the geologist Ferdinand Hayend collected it in the late summer of 1857. At the Gray Herbarium at Harvard, taxonomic confusion is recorded in Hayden's herbaria sample by layers of redacted notes and lists with strike-throughs on the single desiccated specimen that sits there without flowers or fruits. For a while, it had no label at all. This is one of the reasons it makes me curious. Propagation efforts began in the early 80s at the Bessie Nursery in Halsey, Nebraska. You've been seeing pictures of the nursery and the nursery manager. The first federally owned nursery, by the way, the first federally owned nursery. The oldest seedling nursery managed by the USDA, and the nursery established by the Timber Culture Act. This nursery is the one that provided tree seedlings to the CCC all through the shelter belt program that I cover in the book, which is what brought me to the nursery in the first place. So it was a New Deal era machine for distributing trees. Now, of course, the sandhills trying to turn that part of the mobile dune green into the first artificial national forest entirely planted by hand. So it is rather apt that Bessie Nursery is now the site of Nebraska's first federally funded effort to conserve blowout beard tongue. A botanical description of this penstemon starts with its reproductive morphology. Are you still with me? I'm still talking about the same plant. The beard tongue grows in large multi-stem clumps. These clumps hold roots, shoot buds, and leaves that reach 1 to 2 feet in height, with floppy kind of stems that curve and touch the ground, or sand, as it were. The vegetative stems hold unusually narrow basal leaves and remarkably oversized floral bracts. One collector called its symmetry grotesque. I think it's gorgeous. But the plant really lives below ground in the rhizosphere, underground as it were, where stem nodes forage for resources as the plant buries itself in the sand until root hairs find the slightest moisture and invite mycorrhizal relationships to help the rootlessness absorb water. Then the plant reiterates, sends down some more anchor roots, curves again, repeat. The leaves are opposite, as botanists say, but there's so much more. They lean and droop and look relatively relieved in the heat, if such a thing is possible. Those loose leaves are greenish blue or bluish green, depending on the time of day, and they reflect the sky with a waxy, hairless surface. When a flowering stem emerges, it is straight compared to the vegetative stems, and it rises about 18 inches tall, emerging on a thick, juicy stalk, as wide as a half an inch in diameter. Blowout beard tongue is a colonizing species, which means it reproduces asexually by means of offspring that remain attached to the parent. Vegetative growth. At least until they establish. This is how it appears to conservationists working on the surface of the land. The plant is rarely dug up, of course, when it is found, because any study of the root system kills the plant. But in 2012, a study exposed the risk of overcounting plants, interesting, with clonal reproduction. Quote, carefully excavating sand around 10 pairs of stems, we found that the subterranean axis was vertical in all cases, and none of the plants were connected underground, even those that were only 15 centimeters apart. So this study from only a decade ago dispelled the myth of clonal spread that I just described to you. Another twist. It doesn't actually spread clonally. Observations reveal that blowout beard tongue seems to be reproducing with more agility through individual plants rather than sprouting from dormant seed. So rather than these clumps actively moving within the blowout, which is what I just tried to explain to you in a sort of slow, concealed crawl underground, actually the seed is what is enduring against the odds. Seed dispersal is actually one of the least understood phases in the study of plant life cycles, despite being recognized as fundamentally important for understanding distribution, abundance, population dynamics, and the life history variation of any species. For species living in fragmented habitats, like the sandhills, dispersal is crucial for regional persistence. In the field, seedlings are hard to find because blowouts are hard to find. Since the potential for a plant's emergence decreases with increasing burial depth, conservationists began creating small blowouts. So rather than waiting for a blowout, they go in there and they design a blowout, right? Because if you design a blowout, it's a real blowout, and the penstemon will come. Not so. A smaller scale pacification of mobile landscapes. Still, despite all the effort, no beard tongue. Seed dispersal studies reveal that this very deep burial ensures dormancy, suggesting that the seeds want to be pulled into subterranean depths, not blown about on the surface like so many plants in the sandhill. In the seed stage, blowout beard tongue burrows and forms significant seed banks at depths that protect it from ranchers, farmers, and eager conservationists, from insect predation and overgrazing. Imagine a multi-year stockpile of seed resources sinking slowly and deliberately, awaiting favorable climate conditions. Imagine seeds making a decision. A cryptic stage is this blowout beard tongue's life history that unfolds in these concealed layers far away from human eyes. So our little beard tongue is actually quite short-lived above ground, it turns out. The plant, short-lived, but when the seeds are ready, they're slowly distributed over 2 years in tandem with the climate as winds shake its grotesque stalk like a baby's rattle that sheds and disperses directionally along varying patterns. Once the seed lands in the blowout, the next gust or storm moves it even further. It does more. The sand scarifies the seed, sandblasting the coating so that it is primed for growth before it goes dormant. Then the plant dies back and the seeds live on. Scientists believe that seed stock can remain viable underground for decades, but they don't really know. When a blowout occurs at the landscape scale, it actually reveals this dormant seed, exposing it to light and moisture. In time, we can imagine that the proven terms of decades might also just scratch the surface. Studying the individual plant in this case helps take stock of the entire ecosystem, the entire human cultural system as well. It's actually, this species is now being referred to as a harbor species by biologists because it is so fundamental to habitat formation. I like that word, harbor. It speaks of refuge, protection, and shelter. And it makes sense because blowout penstemon is the only plant species among the thousands of annual, biennial, and perennial forbs, grasses, and shrubs in the sandhills capable of germinating in a blowout or loving a blowout. I like this word, love. Humans tend to use the word hate in relation to disturbances such as a blowout, a kind of unplanned variety. But blowout penstemon might just change our minds, might just teach us to love blowouts again. According to Conservation Director Greg Wright, you saw a picture of him before, a Forest Service biologist, blowouts used to be hundreds of meters wide. They were regular occurrence that helped move the sand sea along. And a few hundred meters is less significant if you consider that the sandhills are the combined size of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut put together. Now, with the cultural shame and discord afforded the blowout, Greg and his team cannot exceed a few meters in width when they design their blowouts. To quote Greg, "What is truly missing is scale." Here's the glitch. Conservationists like Greg are still trying to make seed germinate to increase populations, making small artificial blowouts, just waiting for these massive seed stalks to try to emerge. And they don't. I know I've said that again, but that is how it must feel after 30 years, right? They still don't. Throwing seed at human-designed blowouts. That's restoration at the landscape scale. They cannot seem to mimic the mysterious timing between blowout dynamics and blowout beard tongue that initiates succession and invites more plants, pollinators, and creatures into their ecology. Fast forward across those 3 decades of conservation aimed at creating acceptably small blowouts for the beard tongue by manipulating cattle to congregate near certain water tanks and other antics, all while the seed is growing underground, and still nothing. According to Greg, and this is where it comes back around, he says, all we can do now is garden the blowouts. What he's referring to is planting beard tongue that's been grown in the nursery directly into a man-made blowout. They're gardening blowouts at the scale of the Nebraska sandhills. Blowout beard tongue grows inside the same greenhouses that propagate trees for the Forestry Service for tree planting. But for this little forb, nursery manager Richard Gilbert and his team scarify the seed by hand and place each little seed into well-ordered trays with drip line and pots and carefully diversified soil. Once a seedling, Greg and his team take over the penstemon and set to work planting or gardening the blowouts. I watched Greg and his team plant the blowouts, and he turned to me, speaking as an ecologist, and said, "Our approach is scattered risk because we are inevitably wrong." This plant breaks apart the divisions between horticulture and ecology, between cultural and biological conditions, ranching and conservationists, propagation and extinction. The break caused by the blowout beard tongue continues in a conflict between greenhouse growing and direct seeding. Moreover, it cannot ever be a part of a list that specifies ideal plants for the region. It fails so often. So even landscape architects in the area can neither specify it nor source it. Most probably, they don't even know it exists, being so firmly rooted as it is on the endangered index. So if the question is why plant conservation fails, then the answer is because blowout beard tongue does not take well to human intervention. In this case, conservation is cultural, not ecological, not biological, because the effort to design protocols is resisted. It does not scale up to meet a designer's whim, nor does it play nicely with mandates established by the federal government. To scale well, you all know about this, is to develop the quality called scalability, and that is the ability to expand and expand and expand without rethinking the basic elements. Scalability is an attribute of precision, of factories, of assembly lines, of products, and of engineering. Rarely does plant life conform to culturally invented scaling tools. so much the better. Herein lies the history of the sandhills that hasn't been told, as a socio-ecological tale of the failures of settler colonialism and the misadventures of landscape conservation. Instead, perhaps landscape processes such as mobile dunes and the ensuing blowouts can be claimed and loved through multi-species associations. I believe that paying closer attention to plant life helps rewrite and recover the loss of aliveness and behavior in our world. And it might just start in our profession if we can pull ourselves out of the residue of the fixed effect, hit and run landscapes that stand still in the messy wake of modernism. And if we can get out of the way or climb down Aristotle's ladder, then perhaps plants like Blowout beard tongue can help us take a stand, and if you will, against the static inheritance of prior centuries and previous generations. Given the rise of environmental consciousness associated with climate change, it is important for landscape architects to discover how individual plant species can account for our history. And history, I believe, runs counter to the ascendancy of human sciences that no longer seem to inquire with specificity, wrapped up as they are in the scale of global transformations that merely seek problem statements to simplified solutions. It is important, I think, to refocus how methods might actually center living, behaving plants connected to the soil. As Agnes Arbour, one of my favorite plant morphologists, says, to consider the plant for its own sake. One way to start is to begin to love the plants that have no material gain or benefit to humankind. Even the funny-looking ones, the aggressive ones, the ugly ones, the ones that stick out, plants that resist. And so it is in this context that I place my work, grounded in place and history with an eye towards the future. I aim to take stock of where we are in order to change the course, I hope, and avoid the road of assumptions that we can just continue along the same beaten path. The necessary change of thinking and feeling comes with some attention to how we choose our words, build our practices, and create meaningful personal engagement at any scale. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have some time for questions. So, folks raise their hands for questions.
Thank you for letting me talk all about one of my favorite plants for all that time. It was a bit of an experiment. So I enjoy this word landlessness because I've been finding it in literature here and there, and I wasn't sure if it was really a word, but I can recognize that we're teaching landscape architects without necessarily touching the land. And so landlessness actually speaks to the feeling of not having connection. A lot of your generation, my generation too, finds it impossible to imagine owning land in the future. And that's a difficult proposition for a terrestrial species. If you go to where I am in Brooklyn and you ask someone in a high rise what land they bought their condo on, they couldn't tell you if it was fill or clay or granite. They wouldn't know. They didn't even check. So I guess one of the ways I think about landlessness is what the world might look like if it was land full. And I think maybe we'd settle differently. Maybe we make decisions differently and respect the land differently.
How do we balance necessary human intervention and our office? How do we give invasive plants autonomy while trying to protect native species?
It's the question of our time, isn't it? I do think about the scale of the garden because I know that I can control some buckthorn that I'm not in the mood to have on, my property or a client's property or in a municipality. But I know I can't take buckthorn out of the boreal forest myself. because that would scale away from my capacity as an individual. And I also believe that even if we got this whole room together, we couldn't do it. So the alternative is chemicals. And I think when given the opportunity to have buckthorn or glyphosate, most people would choose buckthorn. So do what you can when you can, and embrace the evolution at play on our planet otherwise. I think we use in landscape architecture very often horticultural techniques at ecological scales, and I think that's a misalignment.
I think it's generally understood that climate change is posing really serious problems, and that policy needs to be one of the main ways that we're able to address those problems. And with that means that there's professionals implementing specific species or specific design solutions. We understand that we're going to be wrong a lot of the time, but to me, this seems as though it might freeze us in our place, to be so critical of something being wrong, being fearful of that.
Oh, I hope everything I talked about felt pretty right. But what I would say is that I'm advocating for context again. It's this word that was around for a while, maybe when I was your age. And it's like we've gotten to a place where we want a copy-paste urbanism. We want to be able to do it anywhere and to scale it up. And that's what our shorelines are starting to look like, just one big extruded mess, pardon me. And I think if we take a little closer look at the landlessness and the specificity of different landscapes, we might come up with much more unique and well-calibrated, but potentially limited solutions, if you want to use your word, but limited to that condition. And I think we know enough of how different our land is we can't just extrude the same detail across just the millions of acres that we have. So I'm advocating for context, and plants teach us that. They know where they want to grow and don't want to grow, and you can force them all you want, but as our tale tells us, there are consequences. So I just know where you are, know where you're working, and don't make assumptions that it's just like where you worked before, and get up from behind your screen. I was saying before that I feel that the last decade has taught a lot of landscape architects that they can't be landscape architects without software. That's not true. That's not true. And it's on your generation to help us ratchet that up. And we'll help. But I can just let this keep going too. But.
If I'm understanding correctly, Blowout is a migrating species, both through the first strata of the sand with the seed, but also migrating along with the sand hills or the blowouts as they are moving through the sand hills. And I know you kind of touch on this in some of the work that you can present today, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what plants can teach us about migration.
That's such a nice question. If it wasn't clear enough, the Nebraska sandhills are mobile, and so many attempts of settler colonialists to settle these lands that were free draining and seemingly fecund failed because it's mobile. It's very mobile. They call it the sand sea. It doesn't mean it's all brown or all sand. It's mostly a grassland. But the way that the sea moves is by creating these blowouts. It's sort of, you have a grassy hump, and then it tries to move and it breaks. And it can break at these hundreds of meters across, and then it shifts. And so this blowout, penstemon, is this first succession species that's the only one to come back out in a blowout. And so, of course, they want to be able to cultivate it because it does that so well. like a solution, right? Okay, so then, oh, there's a blowout. Let's go put penstemon on it and we will fix the blowout. But they can't get it to do that, you know, as I've mentioned, despite it all. So how that, you're making the analogy to human migration. Am I correct?
Yes.
That's what you studied, Michelle. I'm better at plants.
Landscapes of retreat.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the prompt. There's some logic to working with the biotic world. It's we're doing a lot of trying to work with geology and work with the climate and work with urbanization processes, but there is not as much attention to what the plants are doing, the biotic world. And so something like how the blowout is pushing itself down into the substrate, it's adapting. And I think the word adaptation is really one that we want to be using more than solution. So how do you adapt? You know, a solution sort of, it depends on, I'm looking at you again, I'm sorry to do that, but you know, what we're doing a lot is we're doing these, how do I put it, like singular solutions to systemic problems. So we have a lot of systemic problems. So then you're putting these individual solutions on them. I think what plants teach us is that the system is interconnected and we're all interconnected. And so we need to adapt within our boundaries and our confines and our capacities and get out of the way sometimes. Just get out of the way sometimes. I mean, yeah, I think that's how I would answer a tough question. I guess it's not an either or, but I do find in my work, especially the work on landscapes of retreat that I didn't talk about, that Michelle just prompted me a little on, that humans that are aware of their landscape are much more adaptable. They're aware of risk, they're aware of flood, they're aware of shaky ground, they're aware of glacial melt. And when they're aware of it, it doesn't come as much as a surprise. It isn't as traumatic when something has to shift or change, when they have to move, or whether it's 2 meters or 2 miles, because they're aware of the risk they live with. I think that growing awareness of landscape processes will ultimately help inhabitants, because we have a landscape illiteracy going on, where people don't know what they're living with. They don't know if they're in drought or not. They need to like check the internet. Is it a drought period? It can't tell. Kids walk down the street in Brooklyn, they can name every sneaker company that's being worn by everybody walking around them, and every car brand on the street, and they can't name the trees. There's no way they can name the trees. So that's the culture we're in right now. I'm not trying to blast it. I acknowledge it. I also have a 15-year-old that knows, well, maybe he knows. You know, but if you accept that culture, then part of what we do is to grow literacy and to help people see what they live with. And that will create stronger social bonds eventually, I believe. Does that make sense? I can't really see your face. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the book covers it, and I did. I selfishly talked about something that isn't in the book because I thought, well, that's a nice opportunity. But the book really covers how state control uses tree planting as a way to, move people, extract minerals, offset something else that's going on, like deforestation, or slash and burn, agriculture. And they put the image of the tree as the emblematic kind of default, that there's no way anyone, including the UN, who spends hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars siphoned into different countries for tree planting initiatives, without asking the very basic questions that a gardener or a landscape architect would ask, right? What would we ask? Who's planting the tree? Where is it drawing resources from? And what species is being planted? Nobody asks these three questions. So they're more interested in just getting numbers in the ground and not in actually growing trees. So if they were trying to grow trees, not plant trees, those semantics matter, then they would go back and check on them. But they don't. So that's where the politics come in, because there's a lot of power compressed on basically non-city environments based on city initiatives. So this idea of city and non-city is me trying to get away from the urban and the rural divide for a second, because I don't believe in that either. So you're either a city or you're not a city, and kind of get down with that. But urbanization is a process that happens everywhere, right? So mine is going through an urbanization process, but it's not a city. So a little peek into the confusions that I'm sure you all have as well. But this world of binaries, like, please, right? We're in the 21st century, so how do we get over it? How do we start to talk about processes like urbanization instead of urban rural? So these projects are mostly happening out of sight and out of mind to the urban elite. And so this is what becomes political as well. I mean, in Western China, these are dryland communities. So dryland communities know exactly how much water they can use as a pastoralist, or as a herder, or even as a settler. They know how much water they can use a year. It's very carefully calibrated for thousands and thousands of years. And so they might have one or two trees that sustain their village, their community, their family. So to be told by the government, incentivized by UNCCD money, that you have to plant 100 trees is an affront. It's an affront because it would take away some of their water, and these are useless trees. So there are a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotes. In Western China, there are a lot of flights, so they just fly over to make sure the farmers have planted these trees, and a lot of people plant them upside down so that they can count, and then they pull them out, and they die, and it doesn't matter. But there are massive nurseries and massive, trucks moving trees around, and planes dropping trees, and Ethiopia plants 1 billion trees in a day, and everybody puts it on that, and nobody's asking these questions. So when we step trees, it's not about numbers. Get one tree to grow old. It's never been harder to plant a tree. It's never been harder to grow a tree. Never been harder. I work with the Arboretum. That is not easy like it used to be. The Arboretum was started in 1872. They had to put in irrigation this year. For the first time. In all that time, they never needed irrigation. So there are realities. I use a very radical example to shed light on some of our more normative processes, and so that we can politicize them. I mean, the New York City, million tree project, that was, so go back and count. The city dumped trees by rail lines and stuff. They never even planted them. They counted them out of the nursery. So something like 30% was actually planted. So it's a waste of resources in a very politicized way to grab headlines. And so as a landscape architect, you have to ask those questions. Where is the tree coming from? And also, like, you can contract grow. You don't learn that in school. You can contract grow. You don't have to go to the nursery to get a tree. You can work with a small nursery and they can source seed and they can grow just for you, just like you want. They can grow a newspaper instead of a plastic pot. And plant small. You know, I mean, let's work with what we got. But these instant landscapes, they're installations, they're not gardens. They have a holding pattern. They take a lot of resources and inputs. That's a 20th century model. Great. It's part of our history. It's great. Like, let's see what the 21st century looks like. It doesn't look the same. You can't go to a plant and say, just gotta plant it.
And folks, thank you so much, Rosetta.